I'd like you to turn in your Bibles tonight to the book of Genesis chapter 23. In Genesis chapter 23, it's been said that time flies when you're having fun. My opinion is time flies regardless of whether or not you're having fun. I think back to the time when I was a child, how long it would take for Christmas and birthdays to come around. As an adult, it seems now as though those things just come upon us very quickly. It seems, at least in my life, that the older I get, the faster time seems to fly. Is that a fair statement? Have you found? Okay, so if that's the case, some of you, the moment you wake up, you're going back to bed. Okay, I'm just teasing. But anyway, and that day's gone just like that. And that's virtually it. We come into Genesis 23 and we're reminded again that God does not provide every detail about the life of Abraham. But it does provide us with the details that are necessary to remind us, as well as subsequent readers, of God's covenant with Israel and details that are pertinent to their history. On the surface, it sometimes seems as though some of the details are unnecessary. But again, as we've mentioned in several messages previously, every detail of the Word of God is inspired and it's profitable to us. It's easy, I think, sometimes for us to read certain passages and give very little thought as to the content of the passages, never really be able to put it into a framework as to why God even included that passage. I think that kind of a mindset is very detrimental to our Christian walk, and I do also believe that we find one of those examples in Genesis 23. The Bible begins in verse number 1 that Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah, and Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, the same as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. 127 years. Can you imagine if she were born, or if she died this year? She would have been born in 1892. Imagine the history that she has seen. I want to begin this message by noticing, first of all, a commendable testimony. Much is often made about the life of Abraham, and I believe little consideration is often given to that of Sarah's. The faith of Abraham is undoubtedly a tremendous focal point throughout Scripture. But we need to be reminded that Sarah also battled many of these same obstacles and obediently followed her husband's leadership. Before we ever look at this text in Genesis 23 in greater detail, let's rehearse some of the details of Abraham's life, but let's try to do so from Sarah's perspective. We don't know when they were married, but eventually, soon, probably if it was a usual thing, she could have been married as early as 15 years old. She and her husband entered what would be often described as a person's midlife. And God suddenly appeared to Abraham and said, I'm going to make from you a great nation. I need you to leave Ur of the Chaldees and leave your family. Break ties and all of that. And Abraham and Sarah immediately moved everything they had to follow God into a realm that was unknown. Perhaps the author of Hebrews phrases it best when he stated, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. Men, you know your spouse's temperament, but most wives do not like that degree of uncertainty. You come home and announce to your wife that you have quit your job. More than likely, she is not going to look at you and say, that is wonderful. I'm so thankful for the time we'll get to spend together. There's probably a little bit of a different perspective on it. There's a fear that now comes with the unknown. It may be that you come home and say, honey, I've retired from my job, and she says, oh no, You are going to be a complete disruption to my schedule. I've known only me, myself, and I for these last 30 years, and now you're going to ruin all of it. I'm no longer going to have a quiet cup of coffee. Instead, I'm going to have you have a quiet cup of coffee. You're going to have to go out on the porch. Who knows what the case might be? Roy might be battling this here in the next few weeks. We'll see what happens. We can do marital counseling if necessary. However, you look at the challenge, ladies. Imagine your husband saying, hey, the Lord told me to leave. Well, that's great. Where are we going? I don't know. Just follow. That's a tremendous step of faith. The age of 75, we know they went from Ur of the Chaldees northwest to Haran. They were there at the age of 75. Sarah would be approximately 65. They left Haran and entered into Canaan. And here is Sarah following this path of uncertainty. But we never find a single statement that indicates Sarah ever protested or argued with her husband Abraham. She also willingly forsook all to follow the Lord. Well, they eventually arrived in the land of Canaan, but yet they never had a place to call home. Throughout our study in Genesis, we've observed that Abraham and Sarah were merely sojourners in a strange land. Well, the famine struck shortly after they arrived, and Abraham unwisely fled to Egypt for help, and it was there that Abraham commanded Sarah, hey, I want you to tell Pharaoh that you're my sister, not my wife. And that decision resulted in her being prepared to become a part of the harem of Pharaoh. I don't know what emotions she battled, but I would certainly think that she battled the emotions of fear and loneliness. I don't know whether she was ever angry with Abraham over this decision. But I sure can't imagine the initial conversation that would take place between Abraham and Sarah when they were reunited. I'll say this, having been married now for over 21 years, that's not a conversation I would want to even remotely have. Men, what would you say to your wife after that brilliant of an idea? Probably the best thing is either I'm sorry or just say nothing at all, okay? But we don't find her reacting. We don't know how all of that took place. But you know what? She still followed Abraham after that, regardless of all the conditions in which they lived. Sarah was faced also with the reality of being childless. As a reality for a lady in this culture, this was regarded by society much different than it is today. A woman who was incapable of conceiving a child was often viewed as somehow being cursed by God. It was the joy of every mother to bring multiple children into the world. But Sarah had the stigmatism of having none. Do you think that was emotionally challenging to her? I would imagine that it would be. But to further complicate it, Sarah was forced to rectify in her own mind how God could fulfill his promise to Abraham while she was incapable of conceiving a child. We don't obviously condone her actions in Genesis 16, but at the same point in time, maybe we could be a little bit more sympathetic in our analysis of them. I'm not able to give you a child, Abraham, father a child through my servant Hagar. Very foolish advice, but also I think we can maybe look at it more sympathetically. Again, not suggesting that we condone it to any degree. Obviously, the decision proved to be a challenge in her relationship to her husband as well as to her servant. I don't know, again, I force into the realm of speculation, and I'm often very careful to go into that realm. But as I think through Genesis 16, the fact that she hadn't had a child, and we know the Lord is obviously in charge of it, but if we were looking at it humanly speaking, Abraham was capable of fathering a child. He did so. The news to Sarah, it's me. It's my fault. In spite of this decision, God in his grace did not give up on either Abraham or Sarah. In fact, he changed their names to mean something that at that time would be unfathomable. Abraham went from Abram to Abraham, meaning going from exalted father to meaning father of a multitude. But he didn't have any children except Ishmael. Sarah had not even conceived, yet God changed her name from Sarai, meaning princess, to Sarah, meaning noblewoman. She would become the mother of a great nation, just as God had promised. But the circumstances sure didn't seem to indicate that. In the midst of all that, she also had to deal with Abraham and Lot. How do you think she felt with Lot? Ladies, maybe your husband has had a family member that just doesn't get his act together. It's easy to get frustrated. What would you have said if your husband was going to go after the various kings to get back Lot after he'd been taken captive? She stayed home. But Abraham goes and rescues Lot. I don't know whether she witnessed the conversation that takes place in Genesis 18 as Abraham interceded on Lot's behalf. We know that they walked off a distance. Were they far enough that Sarah could not see it or could not hear it? We do not know. Do you think Sarah saw the smoke rising from Sodom and Gomorrah as Abraham did? The same questions would come to her mind. I wonder if Lot and his family survived. After she was well beyond childbearing years, she heard the Lord announce that she would give birth. Genesis 18. She laughed. Well, she should have had more faith. Admittedly, she should have, but you would have laughed too. Lord, I believe you got the wrong address here. Okay? That letter was supposed to go somewhere else. That's the tent down the way. But God was perfectly in control of all of this. She laughed at the thought of it, and of course we know that she denied it when she was confronted by it. But before she would conceive the promised seed, she and Abraham once again reacted out of fear, and she claimed to be his sister. And God graciously once again delivered them. God did to her just as he promised he would. She conceived a child, gave birth to the promised seed, and named him Isaac. Then I wonder, did they have any kind of conversation when he was taking him to Mount Moriah? I don't know. I'm puzzled by a lot of those things. Men, can you imagine leaving for 3 days and not saying where you were going? Okay? I would think she at least knew. I don't mean that in an ugly way, but I would think she at least knew he was going to Mount Moriah. It would not be a good thing to wake up and Abraham's gone. Okay? How all that happened, I don't know. They both returned. Sarah's obviously not perfect, but I do believe that she is a tremendous testimony to a life of loving and faithful service to her husband Abraham, and more importantly, to her Lord. Their relationship was not perfect. It had its bumps in the road. I'm sure there were arguments that were throughout their home that we never have recorded in Scripture. If she were married at 15 and lived 112 years with Abraham, you can imagine there would be some things that would have irritated her. But they both remained committed to each other. Their relationship, I believe, suffered hardships. We see some of them. But they endured those hardships together. Their relationship experienced unparalleled joy as well as hardship. But through it all, I believe they remain for us a faithful example of really what a marriage is to be. Is it perfect? No. Are there things that we obviously should not do? Yes. Men, don't go say that your wife is your sister. Okay? Those are not going to be good things. It's just not at all a smart move. But what a testimony at the same point in time to a woman who likewise ventured on an extremely difficult path with her husband. 127 years old, she passes away. I've said oftentimes that Abraham's greatest trial was in Genesis 22. In my study of Genesis 22, I wonder if that was the greatest trial. If it wasn't, I would say, and when I preached through it, I said it possibly could have been his greatest trial. It is also quite possible that the death of his wife was one of the greatest hardships he endured. You can imagine the memories of over 100 years together and everything that was created. And now having lost a significant piece of your life. The time came where she died. That leads us from a commendable testimony to number 2, a grieving husband. We pick up the reading in verse number 1 that Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, the same as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Abraham would now be 137. We'll learn a little bit later on that Isaac was 37 years old when she passed. It's easy for us to read over these statements that so-and-so died and so-and-so died and so-and-so died. But I'm reminded of Genesis chapter number 5, where there's the ominous phrase repeated, and he died, and he died, and he died. Death is the reality as a consequence of sin. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12 reminds us that as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. You and I are, unless the Lord returns, going to face death. That is simply a reality. We do not know when it will be, but we do know that it is something that is certain. And even this one to whom the Lord promised a great nation, she was still a sinner. She still experienced the consequences of sin, and she also faced the reality of death. Sarah died, according to verse 2, in the town of Kirjath Arba, another name for the city of Hebron, according to verse 2. It was a city that was located about 20 miles south of Jerusalem and is an extremely important city in the history of Israel. Its name means 4 cities. Perhaps it was divided at one time into 4 quarters. Jewish writers claim that it is representative of the 4 patriarchs who were buried there, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 4th one being Adam. It's located in the plains of Mamre. We've seen Abraham there frequently, a location that he dwelt in. It plays a significant role throughout the history of Israel, and it's frequently attested to in the Old Testament. We don't know everything that Abraham experienced. We don't know all of his emotions, but we do read in Genesis 23 and verse 2 that he came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. You can only ponder the years they spent together and the memories they had, and ponder and imagine the grief that Abraham experienced. We do know, according to Genesis 25, and we'll see in a future study, that Abraham remarries and fathers additional children. Some of you have gone through the death of a loved one. It may be a spouse, it may be a child, it may be a sibling, it may be all sorts of individuals, a parent. It's not easy. There's the reality of those memories that are there. There's the reality of now a life that is going to be lived apart from that individual. I want to tell you that it's not wrong to sorrow over that individual's death. That's simply a part of it. But at the same point in time, as believers, we must not sorrow, according to 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, as others which have no hope. If your loved one were saved, then the reality is we will be reunited with them. There's coming a future time when we will be raptured together and we won't be separated from them. At the same point in time, the death of a loved one is often a hard thing to go through. But I also want to point out that the death of one spouse does not necessitate that the other spouse die as well. I've known pastors whose wives have passed. They've remarried. They've gone on to serve the Lord. There's nothing wrong with that. That individual whose spouse passed does not have to live in that state of death for the rest of their life. Sometimes people will maybe see a marriage that takes place, in their opinion, too quickly, and they'll jump down the road and say, well, maybe he really didn't love his wife. Can I just tell you to stay out of all that nonsense? The best thing you can do is take your nose and put it back in your own business, all right? That's not a road you go down. You cannot begrudge someone who continues to live a life. The time had come for Sarah to pass. There's no doubt about that. But I also want you to understand, God still had plans for Abraham. Abraham's life was not finished. And it was important for Abraham to continue living and obeying that which God instructed him to do. That leads us in our outline to a third point. It's a very simple outline tonight. A purchased plot, verse number 3. Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Eventually, the time came for Abraham to bury his wife. We're not told the length of the period of mourning. I know the Jewish custom was 30 days. There was nothing that would suggest that would have been the case for Abraham. But Abraham also faced the reality of not owning a single piece of property, in spite of the fact that his feet were walking on the very land God promised him. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Abraham then approached the sons of Heth and asked that they allow him to purchase a burial plot for his wife. If you look in Genesis chapter 10 and verse number 6, you'll find that the sons of Heth were ultimately descendants of Ham. Heth seems to have been the progenitor of the Hittites. We find this land in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 20 that Abraham was promised was also occupied by the Hittites. But you know what Abraham did not do? Abraham did not go and demand that they give him this because it's his anyway. Quite intriguing to note. I think I would have. Hey, I just want you all to know that eventually you're going to lose this land and it's mine. You might as well just go ahead and fess up a piece now. That's not how he functioned. At the same point in time, we might say, why in the world does the Word of God devote nearly 20 verses to the purchase of a burial plot? Couldn't there be more exciting things to talk about than the business transaction that takes place for a man to buy a piece of property to bury his wife on? What in the world does this have to do with the history of Israel? Well, let me point out to you a couple of things. Number one, this is the first possession that Abraham acquired in the land that he sojourned in. This, too, is part of the fulfillment of the covenant. Yes, he would be given a seed, but they would also be given this land on which he had walked. But this is the very first possession. And it would explain to Israel, secondly, the significance of Hebron and how it came to be. Remember, Moses writes this later on, and this enables the Israelites to look back and say, wow, this is how we got this piece of property. This wasn't a mere coincidence of events. This was not a mere business transaction. This was God at work through the hardships of Sarah's death. Haven't you noticed in your own life that oftentimes hardships and trials and adversity are the means through which God blesses us? There are times I wish there would be a better way. All right, Lord, give me the $1 million and all the joy that comes with it. But the challenges are oftentimes that the hardships that we go through are the very ways that God blesses us. I want to challenge you tonight to not allow yourself to become so clouded by the trial that you fail to see what God is doing through the trial. It's very easy for us to look at the hardships and fail to see what God is doing. But yet, as you and I look back, and as we look back in other passages of Scripture, it's very clear at times how God used a particular trial in our lives to get us to a place where we needed to be. But I also have to admit, there are equally times that we may never understand what God is doing. And we may never be able to figure it out. But we still trust Him with all of our heart. Abraham approaches these individuals and he acknowledges in verse 4 that he was a stranger and a sojourner with them. As a stranger, these were not his people. As a sojourner, he had acquired no land. Hebrews chapter 11, you can just listen quickly as I read this. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He hath prepared for them a city. There's a distinction that would have existed within this custom between a foreigner and a resident alien. A resident alien would be an individual who settled in the land and was recognized as having a special status, whereas a foreigner would not. This would better describe how the inhabitants of the land viewed Abraham. But yet Abraham was still faced with the reality, I don't have a piece of property to bury my wife. What a challenge. So he respectfully asks that he be given this place in which he might bury his wife, and verse 5 shows their response to him. The children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. This is quite a commendation to his testimony. While Abraham lived in this land, he chose to do so properly. He didn't take the promise of God and arrogantly or even harshly demand that they treat him as one who's one day going to own this piece of property. Instead, he behaved himself wisely, and I believe in doing so, he earned their respect. They complimented him greatly. They said that you are a mighty prince among us. You are a powerful, a revered sheik of a tribe. You're a man of position and wealth in this country. You're a tribal chieftain. And you've attained a level of importance. Some translations say that this is you are a prince from God, is the phrase that is there. And the reason for that is the word mighty is Elohim. But it does not need to suggest that it came from God. That as a term, as a Hebrew term, suggests might or power. And that's how Abraham was viewed. He had established himself on lots of ways. By this point in time, they had acquired a tremendously large household, so to speak, with servants and animals and all the possessions that were there. And so he was recognized this way. But I also think that it points to the fact of how he chose to conduct himself. And so because of their respect for him, they promised that none of them would withhold one of their sepulchres to be sure that he had a burying place for Sarah. Again, understand how God is working. I think he's working in ways that probably Abraham did not even comprehend. But God is at work in giving this possession to Abraham. So he rises, according to verse 7, and bows himself to the people simply out of respect, to the land, even to the children of Heth. Verse 8. And he communed with them, saying, If it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me to Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which is in the end of his field. For as much money as it is worth, he shall give it me for a possession of a burying place amongst you. Now, in my opinion, Abraham left and found the burial plot and came back, and this was the conversation that takes place. He's discovered this spot, and he desires that they would entreat him on his behalf. He wanted the cave of Machpelah. It was a cave that was located on the far edge of the field. It's very interesting to note that of all of these cities in the middle or in this area, this is one of the few cities that can be identified with certainty. Its location was established on the slope of a hill on the east side of Hebron. When you think of a cave, you probably think of a small little piece of rock, and there would be a little hole that he would be able to be buried on. I have a picture here for you today, and this would be what it would look like now. And it's much larger than what you would anticipate a cave to be. It's surrounded by what is often described as the sacred enclosure. It is a wall about 200 feet long, 115 feet wide, an average height of 50 feet, and a thickness of 8 to 9 feet. Today, it is one of the most jealously guarded sanctuaries in the world. At the southern end of the enclosure is a church, under which is a cave. It is not known, and that is the cave of Machpelah, it is not known whether it has been entered by any man alive today. You go all the way back into the Crusades in 1163. A rabbi wrote that if a Jew were to come and give an additional fee to the keeper of the cave, an iron door would be opened. And he would take a burning candle in and descend into a cave. The first cave was empty. He would go into a second cave and finally reach a third where there were 6 sepulchres: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives. It was said then that a lamp burned in the cave upon the sepulchre continually, both night and day. Today it seems as though all of the entrances are closed. The only known entrances are never opened. Through one of the entrances, there was a stone placed in a circular hole with a stone placed over it with a circular hole that was 1 foot in diameter. That they allowed an individual to lower a lantern down into that chamber to see underneath that church. The individual estimated it to be about a 12-foot square with plastered walls and a door that opened in the southeast side that would appear to be from a rock-cut tomb. On the outside of the wall, near the steps of the southern entrance gateway, is a small hole in the lowest course of the masonry. It's said that the Jews today of Hebron are accustomed to pushing written prayers and vows through that hole to the patriarchs. While Abraham is revered, he's dead and incapable of answering those prayers. Abraham did not demand that he be given the cave. Don't be a Christian who demands that people do favors for you. Pay contractors a worthy price. Don't be one that doesn't pay your bills. It is a tragic shame that many Christian businessmen had worse dealings with professing believers than with unsaved people. That should never be the case, and that should never be the case here in this church. If you tip at a restaurant and leave a tract, you tip appropriately. If you're not going to tip appropriately, don't leave a tract with our church name on it. Okay? I don't want it. Not at all. That is our testimony, and it's not right. And if you go around and demand from local businesses that they do you a favor because you're a Christian, no. If someone chooses to, that's their prerogative. But you never are to expect it and never are to go along as though you are owed that, because you are not. Ephron protests this. He was there, according to verse 10. He dwelt among the children of Heth. He was there assembled with them. And Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even all that went in at the gate of his city, saying, Nay, my Lord, hear me. The field give I thee, and the cave that is therein I give it thee. In the presence of the sons of my people give I it thee. Bury thy dead. Abraham, you go ahead and take it. It's yours. Some interpret this as a pious display that's not genuine. I can't tell you his motive. I can tell you that a law of the Hittites stated that the owner of any property obligated himself to the state for military duties as long as he owned it. It would be to his advantage to get rid of the entire thing, the field as well. But as a means of respect, once again, Abraham bowed himself before the people of the land, and instead of taking the offer, Abraham says in verse number 12, or 13 rather, he spake unto Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, But if thou wilt give it, I pray thee, hear me, I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there. It almost sounds as though we simply have two individuals, one saying, Here, take it, the other one saying, No, let me pay you for it. No, let me take it. No, let me give it to you. Why this battle? It's necessary that Abraham purchase this because it would guarantee that there would be a future burial plot, not only for himself, but as well as for his descendants. There could not be any kind of attempt to reclaim that which was quote unquote given to Abraham. Let me take another time out, not in my notes, and say this. If you give any gift, you give it with no strings attached. You don't give it and remind them that you gave it and hold it over their head. If that's the nature of a gift from you, I don't want anything to do with it. Okay? Well, I gave you $200 10 years ago. Here's $200. Have it back. Because you're not going to hold that over my head. And I know many Christians who do that kind of nonsense. Well, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have that. No, 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 no. Okay? I serve the Lord, not you. He's the one that's blessed me. He's the one that's given things. But when you give gifts, you do not do it with strings attached. They may not do what you want them to do with it. That's not your privilege or your problem anymore. You gave it to them. Okay? You might be more cautious as to how you give things, but be very careful. Nonetheless, he needed to purchase this. And so now Ephron says, okay, he answered Abraham, verse 14, and said, verse 15, My Lord, hearken unto me, the land is worth 400 shekels of silver. Now, this is quite a high price for the land. This is why many commentators say that it was all a pious display earlier on. Is it possible that he is taking advantage of Abraham and his needs? It is certainly possible, maybe even probable. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. Abraham hearkened unto Ephron, and Abraham weighed to Ephron the silver which he had named in the audience of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, current money with a merchant. 400 shekels. Abraham didn't argue the price. Abraham gave it. A lot of great business principles in here. Abraham gave it. Was he being taken advantage of? Perhaps, but Abraham gave it. And he did so in the witness of everybody. There was no doubt that this piece of property now belonged to Abraham. First piece of property that Israel would own in the entire land God promised to them. Could anybody dispute its legitimacy? No, because of the way that Abraham conducted it. There were many who witnessed it, and Abraham took and buried his wife in this cave he had just purchased. Verse 17. The field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was therein, and all the trees that were in the field that were in all the borders round about were made sure it was Abraham's. Unto Abraham for a possession in the presence of the children of Heth before all that went in at the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And when you do a search for Hebron, you'll discover that was an extremely influential and important city in the history of Israel. The field and the cave that is therein were made sure unto Abraham for a possession of a burying place by the sons of Heth. Lessons to consider. Let me give you three of them quickly. Number one, marriage with its hardships and struggles is intended for life, and that is capable of being accomplished. That's God's plan. Is it always going to be easy? Nope. But it's God's plan. Okay? We cannot abandon God's plan. This is it. Okay? Number two, God will fulfill exactly what He has promised to do. God said, you'll get this land. You'll get that land. And then finally, number three, death is a reality we all face. In closing, I want us to turn over to Psalm number 90. We'll conclude with this particular verse. Psalm 90. To my knowledge, none of you in here have died. Some of you sleep well during church, but you always seem to wake up when lunch nears. Psalm number 90. All of us have this reality of death that is still to come. I want you to notice verse 10 of Psalm 90. The days of our years are 80 years and 10. If by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow. For it is soon cut off, and we fly away. What do we have in life? 70? 80? Maybe, maybe not. But it will be soon cut off. James uses the phrase, it's like a vapor. Appears for a little while and then it vanishes away. Now drop to verse 12. So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Hebrews reminds us it's appointed unto men once to die. Your birth date has already been written. I hope and pray that the day you were born again has already been written. Unless the Lord returns, you are one day going to die. That little dash that goes from one's birth date to the day that he died summarizes years of a person's life. Can I ask you a question? What's your dash going to say? What are you living for? Who are you living for? What kind of an impact has your life made on God's kingdom, on the advancement of His agenda? Has it been more about you, or is it about Him? Young people, the tendency is to automatically assume that it's going to be a long time before you die. You have no idea when your last breath may be taken. Most of the time, children bury their parents. It's heartbreaking when parents bury their children. Those are things that seem backwards. But those are realities that people face. A heart attack, an accident. You can be laughing one moment and standing in eternity the next. Let me challenge you to number your days so that we can apply our hearts to wisdom.